Hi, this is Adam Feinberg, and I'm with Harlem Stories. My guest today is Mark Becker.
Thanks, Adam.
Thanks, and I know that I've introduced you before in previous episodes, but not everyone hears all the episodes in order. So why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background and your business?
Sure. Well, I was actually born in Canada, but my first residence as of a few days old was actually in the Bronx. And as a 20-something, I lived for a time on LaSalle Street in Harlem, just south of 125th Street there, between the Columbia Barnard campus and 125th Street. I also spent a couple years in Washington Heights and lived on Upper East, Upper West at various points of my pre-married existence. So I'd like to consider myself an expert on New York City, but you're probably chock full of a lot more facts about Uptown than I am.
Yeah. I've been I bought in Hamilton Heights section of Harlem almost 17 years ago now that I've been living there. But what I didn't know is, at the time when I bought there, is my family history. Which I didn't realize my dad worked at what ultimately became that Harlem Fairway at 125th Street.
Wow.
But, then I later, learned that, one of my grandmothers lived in Harlem briefly, and my other grandmother, actually, she went to Harlem High back, and we found her, I think high school, I guess, flip sign-in book type of thing that they had back then.
Wow.
And it was Harlem High class of 1929.
Whoa.
So, so my family history dates back, almost,
coming on 100 years.
Yeah, close to 100 years, and I didn't know that when I first bought Uptown.
I assume she won't be at the reunion.
No, unfortunately.
May she rest in peace.
Yeah, exactly. So, I've had, actually a relative that actually graduated from City College. So none of this did I know at the time when I, first bought Uptown that, that my family history went back, roughly somewhere around 100 years ago.
Wow.
So, me personally, I've always been a history buff and have, found so many of these facts interesting. Today we're going to talk more about like some interesting stories that I've had, come across, as well as, some neighborhood updates, things that I think that, people that are living uptown, whether considering they're maybe thinking of buying or renting uptown, give them a little bit of, of some updates, because, while there's various blogs out there and various news sources out there, there's nothing that really brings it all together. And I hope this to be, one of those opportunities, help bring some insight in that. So, first off, about a year ago, wound up selling a townhouse near Strivers Row, and it just turned out to be such a fascinating story. And ultimately, we went through this house, 2-family house, absolutely beautiful, 18 feet wide, tremendous original detail, including actually a Star of David in the inlay of the hardwood flooring. So, it tells you a little bit about the history of the neighborhood without necessarily breaking agent fair housing laws. Although we're not actually in a podcast, we're not held by the same standard. We're not actually.
I hope not. I'm about to get politically incorrect, so I hope not.
Yeah, so we're not
kidding.
held by those same standards, but at the same time, obviously, want to try and keep as close to it as possible.
Sure.
But yeah, it just tells a little bit about the demographic of there. The house in and of itself, was absolutely stunningly beautiful. Had all these original details. The buyers I was working with, young couple, and they they're thinking about having kids, and multiple kids at that. And we see this. We're on the parlor floor of the house. And as you're going up the staircase to the second floor, what we see is a landing midway between the two floors. And we see this incredible built-in seat into the side of like where the railing would be. Instead, it just kind of pops out a little bit from where the railing is, and there's this built-in seat. And naturally, my client, who's young and is kind of cool, the attitude and whatnot, she's thinking, I'm like, what? if we buy this house, this is going to be the naughty seat. This is going to be the seat for the kids have their time out in.
But put the dunce cap on, put them there.
Yeah, I can see them whether I'm on the parlor floor. I can see them whether I'm on the second floor.
Sure.
And either way I can see them. And, we go through, and they actually did wind up buying the house. Now, the reason why I wound up mentioning specifically this, this let's call it the naughty seat, is because it actually was quite significant in the storyline. So, of course, naturally, you're going to ask, why is this so significant, this built-in seat over here? So, clients wind up buying the home, and they absolutely loved it. They loved the history of it. It's a block south of, of Strivers Row.
Sure.
It's, absolutely stunningly beautiful, and actually a couple celebrities actually took a look at it.
Interesting.
I'm not gonna say names, but one
Sure.
of them has actually been filming a TV series in the neighborhood, and it's got Harlem in the name, and I know there's a couple that fit in that, so it narrows it down a lot, but not entirely.
Sure.
In any case, they fell in love with it. They purchase it. Okay, now it's time for the insurance. Now, obviously a townhouse is going to be insured differently than a condo or a co-op.
Sure.
It's the real property, it's the whole house. And obviously it's got original details from 1899 when the house was originally built. And they're in spectacular condition. So, first thing that comes across is obviously that you're going to be paying a fortune in replacement costs for insurance, because this is all original. You can't rebuild this stuff again. Not to this caliber. Not with all the original inlay and all the original details. And
so State Farm's going to take you to the cleaners.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I don't know if State Farm's necessarily the best best place for this one, but yeah, you're definitely going to.
You're losing us sponsors, Adam.
Yeah, exactly. But at the same time, I can tell you that that ultimately this was a higher end insurer, and
Sure.
Ultimately in townhouses, especially with a lot of these really detailed, you do want to make sure to have the right kind of insurance person for the property. So that said, the insurance appraiser comes in, to try and give them a reasonable estimate. Now the clients are ecstatic in one way and they're miserable in another way, because they find out that the replacement value of the house is twice what they paid. So obviously they feel they got a great deal, but obviously then you have to pay for that in terms of the premiums.
Sure.
But the really cool part about it was the insurance appraiser actually was pretty knowledgeable on not only the house, but the neighborhood and the type of construction. And he goes and tells them, he's like, this house back in 1899, because of this seat over here, this house was actually originally built to be a brothel.
Huh.
And I'm like, what? And the clients are like, oh man, that is awesome. And not exactly the reaction you might expect from most people, but this is obviously going back to 1899.
Yeah.
So you're building in that whole history component into the equation. So this is the time I can now go back and say to, clients and say, yeah, there was this one time I went back and accidentally sold my clients a former brothel. So, ultimately the placement of the seat was actually really important, we found out. Number one, the madam could actually look into the parlor level and see, those that were being entertained, maybe having an alcoholic beverage,
Sure.
and chatting up with some of the ladies, and she could see some of the behaviors, make sure nothing is getting out of control, and keeping an eye on them from there. But it served a second purpose, which was from that elevation and angle, she could see straight out the glass windows of the front door and through the vestibule, and see who's coming on in from the outside as they're coming up the staircase. Then there was a third benefit of that location over there. If there were ever any problems with any of the girls in any of the bedrooms upstairs, she'd already be halfway up the staircase.
There you go.
So it was kind of like an ideal placement, but I find this to be a fascinating story, and I think a lot of our listeners would probably agree.
Well, I won't ask you if brothels today look the same, because I know you have no idea about that, and neither do I.
I can say that when I first moved into my apartment, it's a very different block than it was back then. But 2 doors down, there was an active live brothel when I first moved in.
Oh, wow.
And there was some raids with the guys in the full armor and the shield.
SWAT team.
Yeah, it was like SWAT team, and they raided the place, and ultimately now it's been converted to a 2-unit condo, and the developer lives on the lower 3 floors and sold the as a second unit on the upper 3 floors with an awesome roof deck that sold for like 1.8 million and change. So what a difference, from a formal brothel when I first moved in there in the mid 2000s to today. It's a luxury condo.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, everything changes.
The neighborhoods have really changed. But in terms of the changes, I think now is probably a good update. Time to provide some updates on things that we know that are happening uptown that might be really useful to go through. So first off, one thing I know, and I think this is quite timely for anybody that's interested in buying or thinking about buying. The possibility is, much of Upper Manhattan, and I'm not including Morningside Heights in this, but most of the properties north of 110th Street, assuming the building financials are good and whatnot, will qualify for a specialized mortgage program called the Community Reinvestment Act Loan Program, CRAs, as they're commonly known. Now, I think at some point it'll probably make sense for me to bring in my banker over at First Republic, talk about, some of the mortgage loan programs that are offered, primarily uptown, because we see a lot of specialized properties uptown that you might not see too often in other parts of Manhattan, such as HDFCs. They're quite plentiful uptown, but it's also the CRA program that we see, a lot. And I can tell you, firsthand, that CRA program has made a lot of difference in my sales uptown. So, as an example, while rates are, and we've been hearing in the last week that rates are starting to go up again after, dropping for the last 6-7 weeks prior to that. Where is approximate mortgage rates today?
I think the best you're going to do on a 30-year fixed is right around 5.625.
Yeah,
in that neighborhood. Yeah,
and that's where this CRA program really comes in, is because you don't necessarily have to be any special qualifiers or anything different or terribly unique to qualify for it. It's based on the neighborhoods. These neighborhoods were once redlined, and that's what the CRA program is meant to address. I guess some form of restitution, for these neighborhoods having been previously redlined. So right now, First Republic is offering, and you just said 5.6 and change. First Republic is offering 3.75 on a 30-year fixed. So this is an amazing opportunity.
For any neighborhood that qualifies?
So,
wow.
Typically you're looking at Central Harlem, you're looking at Hamilton Heights, you're looking at Washington Heights, you're looking at Inwood. East Harlem would probably qualify, or at least most of the properties. And keep in mind, this program is defined by census tract, which is not the same thing as like neighborhood barriers or zip code barriers, or so there's some property that might qualify on one side of the street, but because it's not in the same census tract, it might not qualify on the other side of the street. However, that said, most of those neighborhoods that I've mentioned, are going to have properties that will qualify. Now, that said, in order for First Republic to lend, the building has to be in financially decent shape. Granted, they're willing to really work with us on getting a building qualified, but at the same time, if they're a financial disaster, they might not necessarily want to lend.
Makes sense.
But well-managed buildings, certainly, absolutely. As far as the buyer qualifications, you're going to have pretty decent credit. It doesn't necessarily have to be, 800 or above, but, obviously you need to have strong credit. And I don't know what they're doing right now with the down payment, but I know traditionally that their Eagle loan program, which is a CRA program, I know traditionally they were needed, I want to say 20% down as a minimum, which, for most New Yorkers, most New Yorkers are looking at that if they're looking at co-ops anyway. it's the condo buyers that might not necessarily have like the 20% to or more
Sure.
to put down. Now, I've gotten indications that they might have considered a slightly higher down payment right now, potentially 25%, but that we'll have to go back and check with our banker on. The only other catches are that it must be a primary residence, and combine that with that like you do need to bank something with First Republic. And when we talk about
Open a checking account or something like that.
yeah, or like direct, might have direct deposit if you're a W-2 employee. You might have to have something on balance with them, and they'll work with you to kind of figure that out. But I felt like this is worth mentioning. There are several other banks that do offer these CRA programs. First Republic is definitely the best deal that I've come across, but it might not necessarily be right for every buyer. So we do have other banks that offer it. I know Amalgamated offers it, Bank of America offers it, but that one has an income restriction on it. And I know Citizens has one, and I know Chase and Citi both have like first-time home buyer programs. It's not necessarily a CRA program, but some of those might be advantageous to some buyers. But every bank we need to go through, and it's definitely worth mentioning to our listeners. In terms of mortgage advice, it's not quite the same as going with what mortgage advice you're going to get in the rest of the country, because a lot of our properties don't necessarily fit the same requirements as Fannie and Freddie Mae, that the majority of banks in the rest of the nation qualify for. So, it's always worth it to go with local lenders here that are familiar with lending in Manhattan. So that's always worth mentioning.
Yeah, actually, I remember that when my wife and I first bought in Washington Heights, we weren't even aware of the CRA, and actually Tony Zhao, who I can't remember who he's with Popular now. I can't.
Yeah, he's now with Popular. Yeah,
he's with somebody else before. Anyway, he just unilaterally mentioned it. I'm glad he did, because they were offering, I think, a $4,000 credit for the CRA.
And that's right. And actually, First Republic is offering about that now too.
Yeah, and it effectively paid our closing costs, which was nice.
Nice, very nice.
So that kind of zeroed out. But it was a nice surprise because we didn't even know about it. So I think that you educating your clients, us as brokers, letting our clients know, hey, you're spending a lot of money. You might as well get some help if you can. So look up that zip code and figure out if it's in a CRA.
Yeah, and absolutely. And, having sold in these uptown neighborhoods, quite frequently, I typically have a reasonable idea whether the building will qualify for the CRA. I don't know every building, of course, but as a general code, a lot of the buildings uptown are going to qualify as long as the building itself is financially stable.
Yeah, I think the way I look at it is if it's a neighborhood that could definitely benefit from some economic infusion, the legislature or whoever's in charge of designating these areas has recognized that, and you'll probably be able to get the CRA.
Yeah, because it doesn't just apply to these upper Manhattan neighborhoods. It could apply in Brooklyn or Queens or the Bronx.
Right.
You'll need to know exactly where you're looking, specifically in terms of that. The one other thing that before I move on from the CRA loan programs. Is the neighborhood just south of 110th Street along Central Park West area. I don't know if it necessarily applies to every property, but some of the properties in that area of Manhattan Valley, that's considered Manhattan Valley, there are going to be buildings and apartments that do qualify for that CRA lending program there. I'm less confident of whether every building is going to qualify in that area or not.
Well, they got that big condo between 97th and 100th. I wonder if that one would.
Yeah, you're talking about there's the four buildings. I think 372 through 400
Central Park
West
Towers or something.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I'm not quite sure whether they qualify or not, but certainly Manhattan Valley as a whole. I know at least some of the buildings will qualify. So, that's certainly something if you're interested in, certainly we like to be adding value to all of our conversations with all of our clients, and that's certainly one way that we can do it.
Good.
So, I guess now, getting away from the mortgage moment over here, let's go through. We got a list of a whole slew of neighborhood updates. And, obviously, this is Harlem that we're talking about. We're talking about upper Manhattan neighborhoods. Typically, I go down to like the mid 90s or so as we go into, Manhattan Valley, whether we talk about the Bloomingdale section of the Upper West Side. So we do typically cover from 96th on Street on northward. So some interesting updates that are worth noting. 96 plus Broadway, which is the address is actually technically 250 West 96th Street. The building is finally that new building, and it's right across the street from the subway entrance right over there. It is now ready, and the sales have recently started. 1 through 5 bedroom layouts. It's 23 stories, 131 apartments. And prices start, the smallest units are going to be 1 bedrooms, and prices start at 1.395. So, being right across from the 1, 2, and 3 train, all those conveniences, easy crosstown access. It's a higher end luxury building, so I think that's pretty interesting opportunities for those that are looking for new construction. Also on the new construction end of the spectrum, and definitely worth mentioning right now, is 103rd and Broadway, Toll Brothers. Just got an update yesterday on this, is that the showrooms are finally open, but right now they're not 100% ready. So right now it's limited to private appointments and those that have already requested information. I've been on that, on their list, for additional information. The new building is called the Rockwell, new condos. The Sales Gallery, ironically, is going to be across the street from the Claremont Hall Sales Gallery, which is right around 109th and Broadway.
That's a great area, by the way. Sorry to interject.
Yeah,
but
go ahead.
Recently did a deal with a client up on 104th between Broadway and Amsterdam. And there are certain pockets of Manhattan where you're going to find great value. Now, and how do you define value? Well, the traditional definition of value, of course, is you get a little more for your money than you would somewhere else. And I like that area between 96th and 110 that you're describing, because you still get all the sort of accoutrement of living on the Upper West Side with the nice restaurants and the great retail opportunities. You got your bagel shop, you got your Italian spot, you got your Korean spot, all that sort of stuff. And as well as clothiers, just a great place to go shopping for just about anything. And of course, you're right off the 1 train for an easy, quick trip uptown or downtown. So low 100s right off of Broadway, like you're describing that Toll Brothers project. Great neighborhood.
Yeah, and actually, I'm really glad that you brought this up, specifically that area, north of 96 to 110, specifically between Broadway and Amsterdam. I really love that area as a target. There just isn't a whole lot of options in that area.
Yeah.
So I think this is bringing something really, really a great product where there's just an absolute shortage of condos in that area.
Yeah.
So I think this is really interesting. Not only that, additionally, as you're talking about value, one of the things that I've identified, from the Upper West Side, even going up through Washington Heights, that section between Broadway and Amsterdam, that tends to be a pocket of opportunity and value.
Yeah.
So while you might not necessarily see a whole lot of inventory in that section, there's definitely a lot of value, opportunities in that. For whatever reason, the housing stock over there, and whatever options there are to buy in that area, for whatever reason, it's definitely, a value opportunity.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I also think that particularly that area between Broadway and Amsterdam is discounted a little bit because that block as you go east towards the park between Amsterdam and Columbus is perhaps not quite as aesthetically pleasing. But what I tell clients who are sort of priced out of areas further downtown is, look. You live on 104. My most recent client who bought a gorgeous 1-bedroom with high ceiling, 14-foot ceilings on 104th and Broadway. As I said, look, you're living on 104th Street, you're just going to walk out your front door and you're going to take a right and you're going to go to Broadway. And it makes it if there are some sort of unsavory or not as aesthetically pleasing or developing sections, if we're going to sort of use a euphemism, further towards Amsterdam and Columbus, then it's irrelevant. You're just taking a right, you're going right to Broadway, and that's pretty much where you're conducting most of your affairs there.
Yeah, and I've sold in a co-op that was kind of like Rules on 103rd between Broadway and Amsterdam. Same kind of comments.
Yeah.
There's really great options over there, and actually it's diagonally across the street from this new Toll Brothers project. They are going to also, the smallest units there are going to be 1 bedrooms. Just got the pricing literally yesterday, so I was able to update that. They're going to start around $1.175 million for 1 bedrooms. 2 bed, 2 baths are going to start around just over $2 million, and 3 bed, 3 baths are going to start in the $3.35 million range.
Okay.
So it gives you a wide range of opportunity, and that area just doesn't have a whole lot of condo or even new construction options. I know there's one on 107th. I know there's one on 108th both between Broadway and Amsterdam, but it's not like that there's a lot of volume, and you're reliant on those coming up as resales. Same thing at 110, at Broadway. So those are newer constructions, newish constructions at this point. But there's not a whole lot of inventory. So I'm glad that this Toll Brothers building, and Toll Brothers is known as a luxury builder, so these prices, I think they're good at their starting points, and we'll see how the market absorbs it. But honestly, I think that there's a window there.
Absolutely.
Manhattanville updates. Looking a little further north over here, Columbia University. For those that don't already know, that there's a total of 5 buildings that were part of Phase 1. They're all now complete. There was another building that is now being constructed at the corner of 125th and Broadway. It was previously a McDonald's drive-through. Don't worry, McDonald's might be gone, but they will be coming back in the new Columbia building that's being there. That's going to be residential for students and faculty and guest housing. So I think better that I think that's a best use for that land right there, being right next to the elevated train.
Well, that was an interesting McDonald's because I can't think of another McDonald's or any restaurant really in the city that had parking.
There's still one remaining right around 7th Avenue. I want to say it's in the 130s somewhere. They sacrificed some of their parking lot for a new rental building, but they still maintain a small parking lot and a drive-through. So not
maybe
nearly as
an
large as it
IHOP
was.
or something like that.
There's an IHOP that was at 135th. I think the IHOP is now out of business. Signs are still there, but I think they're closed. But yeah, that gives you a little bit of a sense. So that new building is already now they're already several stories high already at this point. Foundation is already poured. What we know, it's going to be a 34-story tower, 391 feet tall, 175,000 square feet total of with 141,000 odd of community facility space. 5,000 square feet commercial space, which we know is going to include that McDonald's, and a total of 142 residences for the graduate students and faculty members. Going a little deeper into Manhattanville, you've got the Harlem Biospace, which was actually part of the reasons why I was considering Hamilton Heights, 17 years ago. It kind of resembled with Columbia's new campus expansion, kind of resembled a lot with what happened with MIT. It was kind of an emerging area that when MIT decided to expand their campus, and ultimately it created all those biotech incubator type of of spaces.
Yeah.
And I'm seeing the same kind of thing as likely between Columbia's new science center up there and City College's two new science buildings. They spent like $600 million on those two new buildings. The combination, and it's kind of almost wedged between, I said, this new Manhattanville factory district area that they're building out, it sounds like this is going to be very similar to what happened over at MIT. And sure enough, Harlem Biospace, they're adding a second office within that Manhattanville factory district. And ultimately, they're adding another 10,250 square feet of affordable lab space for early stage, small and mid-sized life-size companies, and up to 210 researchers. Now, this is also across, almost kind of diagonally across the street from the new Tasty Cake factory building. There was an original factory building there. Unfortunately, it wasn't salvageable. And ultimately they built a brand new building. So, that's a whole brand new biotech.
But the Tasty Cake is still there.
Yeah, well, there's now a new building, a glass building, in the place of what the original factory, because they couldn't salvage it. It was going to be just too expensive.
Is that going to raise the price of Tasty Cakes?
No, because it's actually now, and Governor Hochul actually had a ribbon cutting ceremony, and it's actually going to be all new lab space and for all sorts of life science type of research. So I think we're going to see that as a larger trend as we look forward. I think that's also that's going to probably push up the price of real estate going forward though. So no to the Tasty Cake, yes to the real estate increases.
I think ding dongs are better anyway.
There's always the hostess, debate, of course. 131st in Amsterdam, 1440 Amsterdam replaces the former supermarket that had burned down, and it's going to be market rate housing, some affordable as well. But there's a new tower being replaced. There was a supermarket there, unfortunately had burned down. I want to say it's somewhere like 7 to 10 years ago. And it's finally, there's been an improved building that is going to start getting built shortly. Continuing a little further north, 145th Street and Amsterdam, there was a former health facility building that was owned by the state. It's going to be replaced with a residential building and community space and a health facility. It's not going to fully replace all the space for the health providers. Some of them will be off to fend for themselves. However, the streams from the neighbors and the area have always been for more affordable housing. So in this case, while they certainly wanted their full medical facility, they're at least getting some of that in return, but they're definitely getting a lot more affordable housing and well needed. 145th Street is a major cross street, so very appropriate place to end up putting it and replacing it. I personally think they're going 9 stories. I personally think they probably should have went 12, and add back that additional community medical facility spaces.
Got it.
But it's approved. It's moving forward. The old building is about to be demolished, probably in the coming weeks ahead.
Maybe we should show up for that. I've always wanted to stand and be a spectator and watch the wrecking ball just tear through a building. Maybe
well, that's one possibility. And on the other side of 145th Street at Lenox, there's another possibility to do that. Unfortunately, there's not much of a wrecking ball opportunity there because a lot of it is already vacant or one-story buildings. So,
I see.
So much more easily torn down. But there was a developer that was looking to put up a large tower in that street. Ultimately, going back and forth, community board. There's a new community board member that's in the socialist camp. I don't necessarily want to get into all the politics of it,
Sure.
but
Oh, I do.
well, we're also a little time constrained too. I think we're coming up on the end of our episode here, and at the same time, they were originally going to build. Originally it was going to be 30% affordable, then 35, 40, 45. They got up to 50, and it still wasn't good enough for the local representative. So basically, the developer pulled the project altogether and now said, instead of building affordable housing and market rate housing, we're going to build a truck stop. And in terms of the protesting, that happened yesterday.
Well, what does that mean, a truck stop? Like a gas station?
No, literally a place for truckers to stop and park and potentially, I guess, rest and but literally.
Can you make any money doing that?
Well, it's zoned for it, and you don't really need to spend much, to create that kind of facility.
And you charge the truckers to.
Yeah, to do that, but I don't think that's the end game here, because it was supposed to open already last week. They haven't even started real construction on it. Not that it would require all that much, but but they haven't started anything. And obviously, I think he's waiting out this person's time in office, and will probably wind up building, housing there ultimately, is my guess. But there were protesters there yesterday in front of the site. The final two pieces, because I know we're running long on this episode here, is the proposal for at the governor's level right now for state and national register for historic places for most of Hamilton Heights. I know Hamilton Heights already at the city level is very much landmarked and has 2 historic districts, but at the state level it's a little different. There's all sorts of funding available, in order to become, landmarked in at the state level, and it's not the same kind of prohibitions that the city has. So I'm actually quite a bit of a supporter of this, and encompasses a rather large swath of the neighborhood. So by the time all is said and done, if this gets approval, almost all of Hamilton Heights will be, landmarked in some way, or historic district in some way.
Wow.
So it's interesting because it doesn't come with the same connotations as, landmarking does at the city level. So,
Right.
So I think this is only helpful, not harmful. And finally, the last thing is a tidbit of news that I wound up getting yesterday. Riverbank State Park is getting $26 million in renovation funds approved last Friday on December 31st.
Wow.
Not December 31st, last business day of the year in December. So Riverbank, if you don't already know it, it is the only state park in Manhattan, and it is on the Hudson River above a water treatment facility. It's the only building of its type in the Western Hemisphere, similar to what you might find over in Japan, where there's playgrounds, built on the rooftops of buildings. So this is not something you typically find.
Yeah.
So only state park like this in Manhattan is absolutely huge. If you don't know of it, it's this hidden gem in Manhattan. People are shocked to find all the sporting events that and activities that can be done over at Riverbank. Running track, football, soccer, baseball, basketball, tennis. You name it, they have a space for it.
Yeah.
So if you haven't seen it, definitely recommend you check it out. It's on the Hudson River, accessible on Riverside Drive, either around 137th or at 145th.
Got it.
I know we've gone long, so we're gonna call it quits for this episode. But thank you for listening to Harlem Stories.
Thank you.